Hey guys, it's Miss Parrish. I'm going to be going over today's lesson, which is solving volume equations. Your lesson before this was on finding volume. So you should have watched that lesson. And in that lesson, whether you watched it or if you were in class, you learned the formula for finding volume and you learned how to solve those. Those are pretty easy, especially after finishing surface area. So today we're going to talk about how to solve volume equations. That means what to do if you know the volume and you're trying to find one of the missing measurements. Now, there's no guided notes today, so you will need some paper. There's really no vocabulary words, but you do need to copy down the examples. Okay. You don't necessarily have to copy all of the words, but you can draw the shape and label the measurements. Or if there's, words and it's short, that might be easier for you to write those. But you do need to take notes, writing every example because that will help you with the assignment at the end of this lesson. Okay. So let's get started. Our essential question is, how do you write equations to solve problems involving volume of rectangular prisms? And we're on standard 6G2. Apply the formulas. Volume equals length times width times height, and volume equals base times height in the context of solving real world and mathematical problems. So just a quick review of volume. Like I said, you did this the other day. Volume is the amount of space inside of a solid figure. You should have written that down in the lesson the other day, but if you didn't or you want to write it again, you're free to write that definition. Please remember that volume is measured in cubic units. Remember when we did area, all of our answers were in units squared. Well, in volume, our answers are in units cubed. That means we put the little 3 instead of the little 2, okay? We talk about how many cubes can fit into the shape. You're measuring or multiplying 3 dimensions instead of just 2. For just a rectangle, we did length times width, but for the volume of a rectangular prism, we're doing length, width, and height. So make sure when you write your answers, when you key your answers in today, you're using those cubic units, not squared. All right, so let's talk about writing equations. It says you can use the formula for volume of a rectangular prism. Remember, our formula was volume equals length times width times height to write an equation. Then solve the equation to find missing measurements in a prism. Okay, now the formula is pretty easy. Like I said, you just multiplied the 3 numbers together. Okay, not very complicated at all. Most of the kids I talked to said they found that to be very easy, and it is. You just multiply the 3 numbers and then write your answer with units cubed. So, but today we're going to work backwards, kind of like we did with area. We're going to know the volume, but we're going to be trying to find either the length, the width, or the height that we don't know. So remember, to solve an equation, your goal is to get the variable by itself by undoing what is attached to it. Remember when we did equations, we used inverse operations. We tried to isolate that variable by itself. So that's what they're talking about here. Remember the big rule, whatever you do to one side, you must do to the other, okay? So let's get started. Example 1, okay? Says Samuel has an ant farm. Oh goodness, sorry about that. Samuel has an ant farm with a volume of 375 cubic inches. The width of the ant farm is 2.5 inches or 2 5/10 inches. The length is 15 inches. What is the height of Samuel's ant farm? Now you can write the words or you can draw a rectangular prism and label the dimensions, okay? But you've got to have something to show what you're dealing with here on example 1. So the first thing you want to do, kind of like again when we did area equations, the first thing you want to do is pull out the information that they're giving you. Okay, we want to pull out any information that will help us solve this problem. So if I'm looking in the very first sentence, um, I see that they're giving me the volume. Okay, so if you're writing the word problem down, underline that. If you're drawing it, make sure you label volume is 375 cubic inches. If you're trying to draw it, I don't know if you talked about this the other day, um, you can draw a rectangle. And if you're going to draw another one, kind of draw it offsetting a little bit. And you've learned by now I'm not an artist. And then connect your corners. And voila, there's a rectangular prism. So you could say, well, I know the volume is 375 cubic inches. What else do we know? Well, I know the width is 2.5. All right, so we're going to call this the width, 2.5 inches. Now remember, only the volume is cubed. The other dimensions, length, width, and height, would just be inches. They would not be cubed. Only your answer, or only your volume is cubed. What else do we know? The length is 15 inches. So we'll call this the length, 15 inches. You have to know 2 out of the 3 dimensions in order to solve this, okay? So we want to know what is the height. I always like to circle what I'm looking for. So when you're solving these, the first thing you want to do, like we've done before, is write your formula. And again, remember your formula is volume equals length times width times height. They're all touching. That means multiply. So step 1 is to write your formula, if you want to write these steps. Step 2 says use the formula to write an equation. That means we're going to plug in the numbers we know. Okay, so I have volume equals length times width times height. Ask yourself, do I know the volume? Yes, I do. It's 375. So that 375 can only go in place of the volume because that's what it represents. You cannot put a number in place of the wrong dimension. Okay, 375 is not the length, it's not the width, it's not the height, so it should not be over here in any of those letters positions. It's the volume, so it can only go in place of the V for volume. So I know my length, which is 15. I know my width, which is 2.5. And I do not know my height. That is what I'm trying to find here. Okay. So just like we did before on area problems, you want to work backwards. Okay. Remember, we're trying to get the variable, in this case, our h for height. We want to get it by itself. So down here, in order to solve the equation, I'm just going to move all this down here. You can just keep it where it's at, but I'm going to move it down here. Okay, so to solve this, I'm going to multiply those two numbers first. So 15 times 2.5. Remember, you can use a calculator as long as you're showing your work. So that becomes 37 and 5/10 times h. And I'm just going to put it together because I know that when they're touching, it means multiply. Okay, so now I have 37 and 5/10 times h, and we have our multiplication equation. Okay, guys, we used multiplication equations when we did equations. We used it when we solved area equations working backwards. So you should be familiar with this by now. Remember, this is a multiplication equation. We solve it by doing the inverse or the opposite, and the opposite of multiplication is division. Remember, we always divide by the number that is attached to the variable because we are trying to get the variable by itself. Okay, so I'm going to divide both sides by 37 and 5/10. That's going to cancel. I've run out of room, so I'm going to have to go here to the side. And in my calculator, I'm going to type in, if you'll look right here, this is 375 divided by, think of that line as a division sign, divided by 37 and 5/10. So I'm going to type that into my calculator. And when I do that, I get 10. And remember, I'm finding the height, so I only need to put inches with this. It's not cubed. It is not the volume. Only the volume is cubed. So the answer for this problem would be 10. 10 would be the height, that my missing measurement. Okay. So let's ask ourselves, how would you find the solution to that problem, example 1, if we used the formula V equals BH? Now that you should have talked in the volume lesson about what the B represents. Now, this is not the same letter B that we did when we used base times height, like for parallelogram. Remember, that was a lowercase b. This is a capital B. What does the capital B represent? If you don't remember, um, Whether you do or you don't, you probably need to write this down. The capital B stands for the base, and what it represents is the base of your diagram, okay? And so the base is going to be the length times the width. So if you know the length and the width, you can multiply those together to get the base. And that's kind of what you're doing anyway. Okay, so if we worked this formula on the previous example, you can only use that if you know those. We do know the length and the width. So the first thing you could have said was, well, what's 15 times 2 and 5/10? Oh, it's 37.5. So you could have shortened it by saying 37.5h. That's kind of like taking a step. You would have had to figure out that the base was, how did we find the base? 15 times 2.5. And then you just replace that here. Okay, so it's pretty much the same thing. Sometimes in a word problem or in a volume problem, they'll just say the base is 37.5. They don't break it down into length and width. So if they ever say the base is this much, then that means they've already multiplied this for you and given you the answer. So it just kind of saves a step. All right, let's look at our next example. Again, you can write the words or you can draw the diagram and label it. Okay, if you decide to draw the diagram, we'll label this one that's already on here. Remember how we drew it on the previous example. Abby has a shoebox with a volume of 609 cubic inches. The length of the shoebox is 14.5 inches. The width is 7 inches. What is the height? Okay, so just like the previous example, we're going to be trying to find the height. So if you, again, you can write the words or you can diagram this. So since this is already drawn, I won't draw another one. My volume is 609 cubic inches. Okay. Always pull out the information you know. Okay. So take a second and copy that down. And we know the length is 14.5 inches or 14.5. We know the width is 7 inches, and we're trying to find the height. So once we've got it diagrammed, okay, and let's go ahead and remember step one is to always write our formula. Volume equals length times width times height. Plug in the numbers you know. Oops. I know my volume. Right here it is. So 609 has to replace the letter V because it's the volume. The length is 14.5 or 14.5. The width is 7. And we're trying to find the height. Always look at what they're asking for. It says, what is the height? So that's the letter that should not be replaced yet. So let's start solving. Okay, remember the first thing we're going to do is multiply these two numbers. Okay, so I've got 14.5 times 7. If you type that in on your calculator, you should get 101.5 times h. Okay, now remember when you get to this point where you have the number and the letter touching, that's your multiplication equation. Okay, that is your multiplication equation. I should have written that on example 1. Okay, that is your multiplication equation. And a multiplication equation, you solve by dividing. Ooh, the computer at home is not. Okay, all right. So just make that note for yourself. If you're afraid you'll forget that, jot that down. Help yourself, okay? So we're going to divide both sides by whatever number is attached to the variable. In this case, 101.5. Sounds like a radio station. That cancels out. And in my calculator, I'm going to type it in from top to bottom. So I've got 609 divided by 101.5. And if you type that in correctly, you should get 6. So my height is 6. We're using inches here. Remember, it is not cubed. It is not the volume. 6 inches. Okay, so that's a couple of examples on finding a missing dimension in a volume problem. All right, so try this one on your own. I want you to pause the video, draw this example that doesn't have a lot of words, so draw this and see if you can find the missing measurement. Okay, hopefully you paused the video and worked this one out. Tells us we are trying to find the height. Okay, this one doesn't give us a lot of information in the words, but it tells you that you're trying to find the height and it has a volume of 15/16. So we've got fractions here. All right. So we know we are trying to find the height. So that's going to be where the question mark is. So we're going to call this the length and this is the width. Don't spend a ton of time stressing over which one's the length, which one's the width. I mean, you can kind of look and tell that this is length and then that's the width going back, but it really does not matter when you're solving this. Okay, so don't stress about it. Just mark those as length and width and then move on. So start with writing your equation. All right, plug in the volume, which is 50. I'm going to write volume up here just to help us out a little bit too. It helps me see it. 15/16 cubic feet. Okay, so 15/16 goes right here. My length is 3/4 times my width, which is 1/2 times the height. Okay, now you can do a couple things here with this fraction. If you think it's easier to just multiply the fractions by hand, that's fine. If you have a calculator that allows you to multiply fractions, great. You can even turn these fractions into decimals. Okay, so I'll kind of show you both ways real quick. So if you choose to keep the fractions, and remember when you multiply fractions, you go straight across. So 3 times 1 is 3, and 4 times 2 is 8. So you have 3/8 h times h. Okay, but then you've got to divide the fractions. So that can be, a little trickier. Remember when you divide fractions, you would say 15/16 divided by 3/8. And then over here you would have 3/8 divided by 3/8. Okay, and then that's when you have to do your keep, change, flip. Keep, change, flip. That gives me 24/24, which is actually 1. This one becomes, I will have to go underneath, 15/16 times 8/3. If you cross reduce, 3 goes into itself 1 time, 3 goes into 15 5 times, 8 goes into itself 1 time, 8 goes into 16 2 times. You get 5/2. So it gets kind of complicated, okay? It we can well, and you have 5/2 is equal to h, because 1h is the same as h. Okay, that converts. 2 goes into 5 2 times with 1 left over. You get 2.5. So that's a lot of work. You can do it that way. You can also say or. You've got 15/16 is equal to, you can turn them into fractions, or I'm sorry, decimals by dividing. So you would say 15 divided by 16 is 0.9375. If you divide 3 by 4, you get 0.75. 1/2 is 0.5. So that's how you would convert. You would divide the top number by the bottom. So you got choices here on a fraction. Hopefully you've got a calculator that can do fractions, but if not, you can, like I said, do it by hand on the left or turn them into decimals. So you've got 0.75 times 0.5. Don't panic about all these decimals if you're using the calculator. So if I multiply those two, I get 375 thousandths times h. There's that multiplication equation. So just divide in your calculator your decimals. Don't panic, you've got a calculator. That cancels. I don't even have to worry about it. So in my calculator, I'm going to type in 0.9375 divided by 0.3. Oops, typed it in wrong. Excuse me, just a second. 0.9375 divided by 375 thousandths, and you get 2.5 or 2.5, like we did over here. That would be feet. So either way, you get 2.5 feet. Okay, so whichever way you think is easiest on a fraction, doing it by hand or turning them into decimals. You got options there. All right, so that's just basic finding volume, okay, or finding missing measurements in a volume equation. So let's quickly look at a couple of multi-step problems. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but we do want you to see how to do one of these, all right? The classroom aquarium holds 30 gallons of water. It is 8/10 feet wide and has a height of 2 feet. Find the length of the aquarium. Now, this one is tricky because let's underline what we know first of all. The aquarium holds 30 gallons of water. Does that say that that's the volume? No, it does not. It says it just holds that much water. So that's where we're going to have to come back to that in a second. It does say that it's 8/10 feet wide and has a height of 2 feet. So again, you can draw one. I don't really have space here, so you're welcome to draw it or just write these words. This is very important to have this example written down. So either do the words or draw it out. So they want us to find the length of the aquarium. Okay, so once again, let's start with our formula. Okay, they didn't give me the volume here. Okay, so I can't fill that in. I don't have enough information to find the length. I have the width and the height, but I don't have the volume. That's where this little piece of information right here comes into play. Again, remember, this didn't say that the volume was 30. It says it holds 30 gallons of water. So this conversion rate or conversion factor right here is what's important. It says 1 cubic foot. Notice we're dealing in feet here, so this is helpful. 1 cubic foot of water equals approximately 7.5 gallons and weighs approximately 62 and 43 pounds. Look at my units in this problem. I have gallons and I have feet, okay? So this is telling me that 1 cubic foot is approximately 7.5 gallons. That's the number I need. I do not need the pounds. Okay, nothing in my problem up here is talking about pounds. But I do need to convert the gallons into feet. So that's where I need this number here. So the step one says find the volume. So I don't even need my formula yet. The first thing I have to do is take the amount of gallons and divide it by the conversion rate. Okay, so I have 30 gallons. It tells me the aquarium holds 30 gallons, and I need to divide that by the conversion rate of 7.5. So in your calculator, do 30 divided by 7.5, and you get 4. Oops, did I? Okay. was looking at the wrong notes here. So you get 4. So the volume is 4 because I took how many gallons of water, I divided it by the conversion factor. Now I can use the 4. The 4 is my volume. So it would be 4 feet cubed. This is the volume. Now that I know the volume, I had to convert the gallons into feet. I can solve to find the length. So now we want to start with our equation. Okay. Plug 4 in for the volume. Now remember, not the 30. The 30 is in gallons. 4 is my volume. We're finding the length. Notice the question says find the length, so nothing should replace the L yet. The width is 8/10. The height is 2. So I've plugged in all of my numbers. Now, just like we did at the beginning of the lesson on those easier problems, you want to multiply the two numbers that you have right there. So in your calculator, do 8/10 times 2, and I get 1 6/10 times L. Now we're down to that multiplication equation where you have the number and letter touching, just like we did on all the others. This is where you divide by the number that is attached to the variable. So we will divide whatever you do to one side, you do to the other. So divide both sides by 1 6/10. So 4 divided by 1 6/10, and you get 2 5/10. What are we dealing with? Feet. So the length is 2.5 or 2 5/10. Two's kind of in the decimal or up a little high. It looks kind of unusual. So 2 5/10 feet would be the length of the aquarium. Okay, this is a multi-step problem. That means you've got to do more than one thing. Okay, so again, before we could find the missing measurement, we had to convert the gallons into feet. Okay, this example is also in your textbook on this lesson on page 432. If you feel like you need to look at that a little better, okay? Feel free. It gives a little bit of details. They have a few little more wordings in there. So if this confuses you, you can go to page 432 in your textbook and it will explain that to you. Okay. So the big thing to remember from today's lesson is let's go back to some of those easier ones here, like this one. You want to always look at your problem, whether they give it to you in word form or whether they just give you the shape. Okay. Pull the information you know, underline it if you can write on it, but find the information you know, then take your formula for volume and plug in the numbers you know in place of the letter they represent. If you know the volume, it goes where the V for volume is. If you know the length, put it where the L is. If you know the W, put it where the W is, and so on. Pay attention to what it's telling you you're finding. That's the letter that you should not be plugging a number in for yet. At that point, after you plug in your numbers, you're going to work backwards. Remember, multiply these two or whatever two you know. At that point, you should be down to your multiplication equation. You should have your volume equaling the product of those two numbers times the variable that you're trying to find. Remember, once you get to that point, it's a multiplication equation. The inverse is division, so we divide both sides by whatever number is attached to the variable, and then you have the answer to your missing measurement. Okay, remember the answer for these will not be cubed, only volume is cubed. All right, you do have an assignment in your Google Classroom for this. Make sure that you show your work on paper for all of the problems. You need to show all of your work. You can use a calculator as long as you're showing all of your work. You must submit your work with your assignment. Type your answers into the Google form, attach your work and submit it. As always, you can contact your teacher if you have any questions. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you guys have a great rest of the day.